Well, hello. I'm going to give a couple minutes, let people start to enter the webinar here and just say hello. My name is Tiffany Westridge Robertson. I am the CEO of International Foundation for Autoimmune and Autoinflammatory Arthritis, or AiArthritis for short. And I will be hosting the Rewatch party today. Yay! And for all of you who are joining us and you're a person living with Still's disease, whether you're a person diagnosed, parent of a juvenile, a caregiver of an adult, we want to welcome you and wish you the best Still's Disease Awareness Day ever. So this is a day not only to raise awareness, but to celebrate you and everything that we're trying to do to bring more attention to this disease. So one of the things that we did in conjunction with Still's Disease Awareness Day and leading up to it was we joined forces with the Systemic SJIA Foundation, with Autoinflammatory Alliance, and then also our sponsors, a couple of the sponsors that have provided funding for Still's Awareness Day, Sobi and Avalo Therapeutics. So we joined forces and we hosted a webinar here a week ago. Oh gosh, whew, time is flying. A week ago today. And what we do on the watch parties is, and we do this at our organization when we go to conferences. So there's a lot of technical, scientific stuff that happens when you go and look at research, and there were some of that presented, especially with Sobi and Avalo. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through some highlights really of the webinar, and then we'll pause and we'll talk about it. So I'll ask you some questions. You can talk in the chat and feel free to ask questions. Will I know all the answers? No, but I will certainly get the answers if I don't know what you're asking. So all of the people who did present know that we're doing this, and they are also available. So don't feel like, oh, well, they're not here, I can't ask the questions. You absolutely can, because we will relay those to them, and then we're going to package all the questions and answers from the original webinar and from this, and we'll be giving you all of those answers. So don't feel like you can't ask questions. We definitely encourage you to do so. So how this will work, again, I'll put a little bit of a segment of what we saw on the original webinar. The first segment's me, so I'll turn my video off so you're not watching me twice. And it's a little bit of a history on what clinical trials are, because research to get to the therapy, the treatments that we use for our diseases, for your disease, for Still's disease, all come from initial research. And one of the things we realized at our organization is we're doing a great job of educating and raising awareness, but one of the things we haven't really touched on or done a lot of is teaching you all about the behind the scenes, the research part, and how you can get involved in that if you so choose. So that's what this is about. Again, I see some people say happy Still's Disease Day. Yes, absolutely. We're going to go ahead and get started. So we had, I think, about 20 or so people who said they were going to come and join us. So we might have people coming in and out, and that's just absolutely fine. But if you'd like to say hello in the chat, where you're tuning in from, how Still's affects you, that would be fantastic. And let's go ahead and get started. So let me advance. I don't think I need to educate anyone here on what Still's disease is, but I thought I better put the slide in just for the fact that we're talking about research that's impacting Still's disease, and wanted to just clarify because this is fairly new and not everyone is aware that Still's disease has become the umbrella term that's inclusive of systemic juvenile idiopathic arthritis, or SJIA, and also adult onset Still's disease. So it has been recognized that it is the same disease. It may present differently, a little bit in juvenile versus adult, but it's enough overlapping that scientists and researchers have realized it is in itself its own disease. So one of the reasons that I wanted to point this out also for Still's Disease Awareness Day is I know for a lot of people, there's been challenges on trying to get doctors to understand. I know some people with adult onset will say, well, my doctor or this specialist or this hospital worker said that I can't have this because it's a child's disease. And then on the flip side, having the word arthritis in SJIA can be very misleading as well, especially if it's misunderstood to be juvenile idiopathic arthritis. That does not have the systemic features to it. So that umbrella term of Still's disease, we're really hoping will help in the long run, not only with awareness and education, but also with research, which we'll touch on here a little today. Hello from Maryland is in the house. I see. We got different locations. I'm tuning in from St. Louis, Missouri in the United States. So what we're going to do is I'm going to I'm going to bring over my YouTube, and this the webinar in its entirety is on our YouTube channel. So we will make sure that we provide you with that link as well as a recording to this one when we are finished. So I'm going to pull this from YouTube, and what we're going to do is we're going to watch, you can see it's just an excerpt, and it's talking about clinical trials. Oops, let me move my camera so you can see my screen. And so one of the things just to think about, and feel free to add this in the chat, is have you ever been in a clinical trial? And if so, why did you join one? And if you haven't, why haven't you joined one? And so we want to talk a little bit about that. And then if you have any questions or concerns about trials, by all means, feel free to chat about it or ask in the chat box. And if I can't answer those, I will definitely get you answers from somebody who can answer those for you. So I will bring over the video and let's watch the first segment. What we wanted you to just understand is that clinical trials are done because they're research studies and they're evaluating the different interventions, the different ways that we could possibly find a new treatment, a new intervention, maybe even prevent disease activity. But all of that really has to be done in these different phases, 1 through 4 of research. So what ends up happening is when an idea, a concept, a mechanism of action is identified as a possible solution to help us, to help people living with Still's disease, the researchers then need to jump in and figure out, is this intervention going to be safe? Is it effective? Is it better possibly than current standards of treatment? And then it's also based on need. So we put a little picture here of a brain and brainstorming, and we did that purposefully because your voice matters. So one of the things that happens is we see from prior treatments what's working in Still's disease, what's not working, and then we can listen from you and what's working for you and why is it not. And those type of reasons and rationale is why we need to continue the research that we're doing for Still's and other diseases, because it has the potential to change lives. So I'm not going to go into the phases 1 through 4, other than to just say they start off testing it with a few people to see if it's safe. Then the trials get bigger, and then it doesn't work. And then they get bigger, and then we test more people and find out, is that better than the existing? And then it goes into the regulatory process. So that could be the Food and Drug Administration, it could be the European Medicines Agency in Europe, and they decide if it's safe and effective to put onto market. And then sometimes there's also a phase 4 trial, and it could be testing for additional use or other ways to improve the disease. There's many other reasons why it will advance to stage 4 once it is sort of post-market, if you will. And you can also, I put a couple links on the bottom. 2 of the really great websites that teach you a little bit about clinical trials are the FDA and the EMA, and you can literally Google those with clinical trials and it'll come up with amazing information on the page. Okay, I'm back. So that's the only part of what I was talking about that I'm going to play on that. But one of the things that I wanted to show or talk a little bit more about is this photo that we have here. So one of the things that I really like about this one is that when we think about research and we think about, I don't know if you know this or not, but it typically takes 10 to 15 years for a drug to get to market. So think about all the research that has to happen before that. And one of the reasons why historically the clinical trials that we know today is that it is hard or it is not individual disease. So if you and where you're not being treatment is not as effective, then if you were the only one in the it would show that the treatment may not be effective, but it could be for 60% of the others. That's why when we do trials, we need to make sure that at least a few people, and what I meant when I talked about the stages. When there's a phase one, it's usually just a handful of people. You're going to see that in the Okay, I think I lost the connection. All of a sudden I disappeared, so I'm not sure where I was when I was talking here. I'm going to share my screen again, and hopefully we're all back online. I see that there are still people in there in the chat. I'm back. Okay, good. Well, I'm really sorry about that because I updated my internet last night to have more powerful internet. So really didn't expect that to happen. Hopefully we'll have smooth sailing here moving out. But what I was saying, and I'm sorry, I'm not sure exactly where I faded out, but in order to study the research, in order to get to the treatments that we need, we got to remember where everybody with stills presents uniquely. We have different onsets. So because of that, it's important in at least those first phases that they usually have about 6 to 10 people that are in the trials. And then, which we'll see in some of the examples of the trials that were presented by Sobi and Avalo Therapeutics, is that they are now moving on to other phases. So there was some success in seeing that, but 10 even not enough. So that's why clinical trials take a while to get through. And even with rare diseases like Still's disease can become much more challenging because it's more difficult to recruit if there's not as many people living with the disease. So I'm looking in the chat. I don't see any comments or questions, so I'm going to go ahead and move on. And we're going to watch an excerpt from Rashmi, and that is founder and co-founder and president of the Systemic JIA Foundation. And what the focus is in this part of the conversation is the goals. And she talks a lot about really it just takes a village. It takes a lot of people to figure out what is most important for treatment needs. So think about when you're watching this, what are your treatment needs? And if you think about being able to have a voice and work together, if you were able to sit down and talk to pharmaceutical companies, talk to researchers, what would you say? What would you want them to know? And so let's go ahead and I'm going to move my screen over here. I'm going to bring the video back and we are going to jump up to minute marker
In February 2013, my one-year-old boy was diagnosed with SJIA. And we started learning about it a little bit. And at first we were told that, he was biologics helped the disease and he was put on some biologics. But within a year, it became clear that he was not going to go into remission with biologics, at least not immediately. And he got diagnosed with another rare complication in an already rare disease, called interstitial lung disease, and started with some clubbing in his fingers and toes. And he had repeated episodes, which some of you might have experienced as well. Well, I used to read a lot of scientific papers about SJIA, and I had read this paper that patients who are diagnosed with this kind of lung disease often have a very bad outcome. And 70% of these kids were dying within 9 months from the pulmonary diagnosis. So that was the moment at which I said, well, my career is not more important than this. And I started thinking about how do we actually help my child and other patients like him. So my son was patient one who we found, and then not found, who was diagnosed, and then we started the search for other patients. And now, of course, I've learned a lot about rare disease organizations and how they work towards a cure. And our foundation is now part of a program with other 29 other organizations. But at that point, I was just starting off without knowing any of this, with just the bet that we could help my son. So the first thing we did was that we worked with a researcher. This was at that point I was at Stanford, going to Stanford Hospital. We worked with a researcher to organize the first research conference focused on this lung complication in SJIA. And after that, we organized several other research conferences since then, in probably about once in every 2 years about. And what we do is that we bring together patients, researchers, clinicians, regulators from FDA and EMA, and pharma, and we have them all sit together and we try to discuss new upcoming therapies and of course what patient needs are, what are we seeing in the field. And we think that by having this open communication of everybody understanding each other, we can make things move faster. So that is one of our important goals.
Okay, so I'm going to move it back now, and I apologize again for internet. I'm not really sure what's going on with that one. But I think what I wanted to pull out of this part with Rajmi was really that it is so important. And I love the fact that their organization is doing that, where they come together every year. And I know recently it's been virtual, and they've been able to bring patients and researchers and doctors and pharmaceutical companies all to the table to talk about needs. And again, that is predominantly systemic JIA. And I wanted to make sure that you all know too, with our organization, with AiArthritis, our whole mission is to unite, to bring you a voice, to bring all of the people living with these diseases a voice as equals at the table, so that together we can solve problems that impact education, advocacy, and research. So in saying that, we also present those opportunities to you. And so some of you have signed up for our AiArthritis Voices program, and that is how we do that. So I know we'll provide some more information about that at the end as well. But that is one way that if you're interested in coming to the table and answering these questions, we really would love to hear from you. And again, if you're not comfortable saying it in the chat, if we provide these type of questions after the fact, we'd love to be able to hear from you, because we can give these to Sobi, we can give these to Avalo Therapeutics and all of the other pharmaceutical companies that are creating treatments. But first we have to know what has worked for you, and why do you think that is, and what hasn't worked for you, and what happened to make you realize that it wasn't working, and what do you think needs to be studied more in regards to Still's disease. So these are the types of questions that we need to be answering as people with lived experience, because that's going to help to direct the research as we go through. So Katie, thank you for mentioning this one, the way to sign up for AiArthritis Voices. So let's move on to watch Rashmi again. This is, she talks a little bit about IL-18, which I will explain a little bit more in a minute what IL-18 is on a future slide. But one of the things that is going to be a focus here, and when you hear from Sobi and Avalo, is this term refractory. And what that really means is resistant to treatment. So if you hear somebody say, well, you're refractory, what's that? It means that maybe you've tried a lot of treatments and they're just not working for you. So Rashmi's child who was diagnosed when they were 1 with systemic JIA was considered refractory because they were not responding to the typical biologics that at least to be stable enough. So that's what this focus is and why it's so important for people to be connected to the right treatment at the right time. So let me bring my video back here, and I need to go to 1407. Scroll up here, and let's watch Rashmi.
Samples that have been collected at all these conferences that we've organized and other ways as well, is that a lot of the refractory patients actually have high IL-18 and sometimes elevated CXCL9 as well. And these refractory patients also tend to have MAS. And there's a bunch of drugs that are currently approved for SJIA, but these patients, even after trying those biologics and trying different immunosuppressants, the IL-18, etc., still can remain elevated. And this chart shows, this is brought from a paper by Dr. Scott Canna, and it shows how this IL-18 is elevated in SJIA anyway, but these particular patients that I'm talking about with a history of MAS, they can have chronic elevation of IL-18, etc. So it seems like these are good biomarkers, and you're going to hear further about this later on in the this session. Now, coming back to the lung disease.
Okay, so I'm back, and this is something that as an organization, I mentioned if you were on in the beginning, I see we've had a few more join us, so welcome, and happy still to see the awareness data, those tuning in. One of the things that as an organization we do every year, we go to the American College of Rheumatology, which you'll see noted on the bottom of the screen. It says the ACR meeting. That would be the American College of Rheumatology meeting. And that's usually in November of every year. We also attend EULAR, which is the European Scientific Conference. And when I say scientific, this is what I mean. So when you look at the slide, sometimes it's not easy to read. So what we try to do as an organization is just what I'm doing now. And that is sort of helping navigate through the words, through the definitions. What exactly are we looking at here? And I know Rashmi did a really good job of explaining it as she was going as well. But the bottom line is I wanted to put a couple definitions out. So we like to call it kind of definition time. And we also are happy to provide you with a list of these type of terms. We collect them every time we go to conferences and we define them. So our list is getting very long. But if you're interested in research and being able to look up these studies and learn more and maybe understand them a little bit deeper because they are very complex, we like to give these glossaries because I think it kind of helps break it down a little bit. So when we talk about biomarkers, that is something that is measurable. When we're talking about research, and if you're in a clinical trial, or even if you're not, even if you're on a treatment right now, and we would call that post-market surveillance, where you might be monitored to see how well the treatment is working, and often that's your doctor, right? They're saying, how are you feeling? They're taking blood work. They're saying your markers are high, your markers seem under control, and you're like, but I still feel bad. So that's all kind of, part of seeing, is this treatment working? And one of the things that it really is we're moving forward to as far as studying diseases like Still's disease are biomarkers. Now, there currently is not a known 100% definitive biomarker that can say, if you have this biomarker, you probably have Still's disease. So it's not like that. And then some biomarkers, which could be genetics, like I'll use one, for example, like the rheumatoid factor, RF. You might see that on your blood work. Now, typically that is negative in persons with Still's. Does that mean you can't? No, of course you could be positive. But did you know that people walking around everywhere can be RF positive and they don't have rheumatoid arthritis or any other disease? So just because a biomarker shows up, it is something we can measure, but it does not necessarily define how a person may feel or even if they're positive for disease in some cases. But the important thing is, if we have things we can measure And then we can say, wow, this is really elevated in this subgroup of Still's disease patients, and it's not so much, or this medication controls it. So when we say IL, and we like to put the phonetic IL, it's short for interleukin. And again, big word. And essentially, think about it as part of your bloodstream, part of your body, where you have these proteins that essentially are responding to things. I mean, that's kind of the real layman's terms. So they mediate your inflammatory responses and your immune responses. So researchers try to identify those, and in the different families. So you might have heard like IL-6, and some of your like, oh, what's an IL-6? That's what it's targeting something very specific. So in this case, Rashmi was showing about studies that are looking at IL-18. So it's one of these markers where they tend to be really high in people living with Still's. So the theory is, if we want to control that immune and inflammatory response, how would an IL-18 inhibitor, meaning stop, how would, if that could help? So that's one of the things that's been in studies. So when you look back, this was 2016 that we're looking at this, and now there's the data, there's the background, there's the history that's telling our researchers, okay, now let's move forward. We have enough of a theory that this could work, so then they can get the license to start the different research and the different type of treatments. What I did also wanted to point out, when we talk about clinical trials, it's not always about treatments. It can be about different interventions, or just simply figuring out more information about a disease. So I found this by literally Googling IL-18 in trials, and this came up. And so I just wanted to show you, if you wanted to kind of go on your own and say, I'm kind of interested in learning more about this, I mean, Google could be a good tool for that. Just be, mindful of what you're pulling up. So you want to make sure it's credible information, and not maybe a republication on a website that may or may not be firsthand data. The problem with that, again, is very scientific, but we're hoping that by doing things like this, we are able to help you navigate through that if you're interested. So one of the things that I saw here was just, and I kind of pulled out the main point, was that that again, this possible disease biomarker of IL-18 associated with people with Still's. Now, this is a study for adults, but again, we said in the beginning, Still's disease is now considered an umbrella. It is the same disease, whether it is it's just, if it's 16 or over, it's onset in adult, and if it's under, it's considered SJIA, but the same disease. So knowing that for you is also important, because if you look at these and you say, wow, this would happen in adult onset, but I have SJIA. Well, guess what? Now research is starting to cross over, and if it's been in one group, then it's going to be looked at and translated because of the one disease. So it's so important for you all to realize. And just as a side note, I mentioned in the video you saw earlier, the snippet of me, and I talked about the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, and the EMA, the European Medicines Agency. They're the ones who, after clinical trials get to a certain phase, they review all of the information to see if it is truly safe and effective enough in order to warrant going to market. And one of the things that I know is happening in Europe with Still's disease in particular is the EMA is looking at this and saying, well, if this was approved for SJIA, then theoretically, now that it's considered one continuum, this medication could be used for adult onset as well. So again, opening up the therapies because of that. So that is, still is, I'll date it. We're here in 2021 for people who watch this, in the future. But I really wanted to just point that out, that there's a lot of reasons for being part of research, and it's not always about, if you hear clinical trial, it's not always about testing different drugs. Okay, I'm looking at the chat. I don't see any other questions. So one of the things that I wanted to do is highlight this, that Rashmi had said. It's instead of playing the whole video, a slide. And the reason I'm pulling this up is because of subtypes. So, we talked a little bit about biomarkers and what that means. But the other part about that is, as we're starting to define research and look into that individual, your individuals, your the way that you respond to treatments may or may not be the same as others. And if you're in like online groups, you've talked to other patients, you probably have heard this. You might think, wow, this worked so great for me, but then somebody else says, oh, that didn't work for me at all. And that's because everybody still has some type of uniqueness. So a movement in all of our diseases and all of the autoinflammatory, autoimmune disease groups, there's a movement towards understanding what we say subgroups or subtypes. Because if right now, if in the current clinical trials, what happens is they try to get what they say is the general patient population. Well, shoot, that's hard when you have a disease that's so individualized. And then that's why current treatments, because the trials bring in what they consider that general patient population. So you could try to be in a trial, you may not be able to be in there because you don't meet the blood work, you don't meet, you have a comorbidity and it excludes you. So it's a very finite group of people. So what happens is when the treatment goes to market, maybe only 60% or 40% are really having high success on that. So that's why when you talk to other people, some are great on it and some aren't. So the theory is that let's start focusing on these subgroups. And then by doing that, maybe you can have a treatment that works better for you, and the same with others. So the IL-18 is one of the first subsets to be identified relating to these patients have this high marker. And theoretically, if we treat with that, will that help these patients? Again, the other aisles can maybe are helping other subgroups. So it's just trying to identify this. And you as a person living with these diseases, we can definitely connect you with opportunities to be able to see, well, what kind of subgroup would I be in, and that type of thing, because that's what we do as an organization. So more than happy to get you involved. And again, I know Katie put the link in for our AiArthritis Voices program. We're going to do a quick snippet here of Jeanette Bashir, who's a research and medical advisor at SOBI. And they were presented a trial that they are starting to recruit now for MAS. And some of you may have experienced this. If you have and you would like to enter anything in the chat, have you ever experienced it? If not, what do you wish you knew more about? It might just say, well, gosh, I'd love to be a little bit more educated, like what to look for, things of that nature. If you've had it, what would you like others to be educated about? So those are things to think about. And again, we can package these questions together and follow up after the fact. But those type of answers and information will help us as an organization help you and help others. Because when we hear from you and we hear from the patient voice, then that's how we can develop the materials that you need. So let's listen to Jeanette. I did snip this one down quite a bit because it's pretty scientific. And then I'm going to jump in and do a little bit of explanation for you. So let me go to, let's see, it's 2649. So let me go to 2649. I'm going to turn my video off.
And good morning, everyone. So today I'm presenting on behalf of a big SOBI team. I think a lot of them are already here, and I'm speaking not about still, I'm speaking about a complication in still, which is macrophage activation syndrome. But please, before entering my speech, I would like just to say that this slide deck is for educational purpose, and the program about MAS, which is sponsored by SOBI. It's not a promotional program. So what is MAS? As we said, MAS, it stands for macrophage activation syndrome. It is a disease that it is linked to overactivation of the immune system, and it is usually observed in the context of an underlying disease. So we always have an underlying disease, and in our case, it is a rheumatological disease. And this rheumatological disease could be, of course, still disease in priority, but it can also be lupus or Kawasaki or any other rheumatological disease. So what we should keep in mind that MAS is a rare disease. It's a disease that it's observed in adults, it's observed in pediatrics patient, but it is a rare disease. So for example, we observe it in around 10% of pediatric patients who present the pediatric form of the disease, SJIA, and in around 15% of the adult patients who present the cell disease. So it's rare, but also what we should keep in mind that it is a life-threatening disease, and this is really very important. It is a life-threatening disease, and it is a disease with a very big, significant burden on the patient, but also on the caregiver, on the family, on everyone. So, and you'll understand later on why I am saying this. So, how MAS is to present clinically? We have 3 different patterns. You can see on the right part of the slide deck, the 3 different presentation of MAS. First of all, we have the classic MAS, which is the most frequent presentation. What does that mean? This means the patient has an underlying disease, well diagnosed, well known, well confirmed, and then later on, he will present MAS as a complication of this underlying disease. This is the first form. The second form, which is observed in approximately 25%, MAS is observed at the time of the diagnosis. So the patient, when he will go to the doctor, to the clinic, he will go with a MAS symptomatology. And because MAS is always triggered by something, then the doctor will have to look about this trigger, and then he will diagnose the cell disease at a later time point. And then we have this persisting relapsing MAS. This is a form of MAS that Rashmi spoke about in her speech, and it is very rare, and it is a MAS that continues appearing and appearing and appearing in a patient life who has the underlying disease well diagnosed and confirmed. So when MAS it occurs, we know that it will attack a lot of our organ. It can attack the lung, it can attack the liver, it can attack the neurological system. So clinically, usually it is very difficult to diagnose MAS, and it can be easily confused with underlying disease. However, there are still some typical symptoms that you should be aware about that can help you to make a kind of differentiation. First of all, for example, the fever that you observe in MAS, it's not really the fever that you observe in the underlying disease, because in MAS the fever is very high. It's a persistent fever. It's a non-remitting fever. In MAS, we have rash, and the rash is usually different from what we observe in the underlying disease, because it's related to the low platelet and to the resulting bleeding. So it's the patient will present, for example, with some mucosal bleeding, with some skin bleeding, with some very easy bruising, and of course, depending on what organ will be impacted, and the patient will present the symptomatologies that can correspond. And what I want you really to keep in mind is that when MAS is here, MAS is a quickly deteriorating disease. It means within hours or even within a day, the patient or the outcome of the patient can be really very severe. And I hate to say it, but MAS can take a very fatal course very quickly and very rapidly. So it is very essential, and it is very important that when we think about MAS, that we call our doctor and work on a diagnosis immediately with him, and that we start a treatment. This is an emergency. We need to start a treatment very, very quickly.
Okay. going to put that one back, start my video back up. I'm back. Excuse me. So that gave a little, I hope that gave you a little bit more information about MASS and sort of what to look for. One of the things that I thought was really interesting, actually, let me put that screen back up here. I won't play it, but something that I thought personally, as knowing about stills. Now, just as for those who aren't familiar, I live with AiArthritis diseases myself. It is not stills, but I definitely have become very intimate with understanding the disease. And one of the things that I felt was worthy of pointing out here is that the fevers are different. So I would, if I'm thinking of an education for people who need to be on the lookout, or for doctors, or for emergency rooms, I think that knowing that, oh wait, my fever's different this time. And now I know that there's a percentage that experience MASS with onset of stills, whether that's juvenile or adult. And I think especially if you're already living with it, that would be a really big indicator. Like, my fevers seem different. And so I just wanted to point that out because I thought it was an opportunity to kind of zero in on maybe some education. So if you had any opinions on that, would love to hear that as well. So let me go back over here. And again, if you're comfortable and want to add anything in the chat, feel free. Otherwise, we will make sure that we send you the list of these questions, because your voice matters. We only know what to provide education if you let us know, or what works or what hasn't worked. And you saw that I just sort of came to a conclusion, possibly, of the differentiation of the fevers could be a good point. But we need to hear from you. It's very important for that. So. All right, let's move to the next here. So she went in and talked a lot about what they're doing. So Sobi recognized that obviously MASS is a huge problem. And because it's so serious, they really wanted to address, well, how can we stop it from happening? How can we prevent it from getting, getting so bad so quick? And you may have heard the term cytokine storm. It became fairly popularized. I know in the stills community, you may have heard of it before COVID, but the rest of the world sort of got introduced to it in COVID. So because when the severe cases, that was what was happening to a lot of people. And so it's sort of become more on the forefront. And as she said, they're not sure exactly what always triggers it, but I took out the video part. And of course, you can go back again and listen to the whole thing, but it was very scientific, very technical. And what I wanted you to look at was the IFN little Y that they have there. And that is the inflammatory marker. That's the thing that's being controlled here. So we talked about IL-18 before. So just think about this as another mechanism of stopping something in its tracks. So if you sort of look at the graph here, their theory is, can we block the activity of this IFNY, and will it help to not move over? So will it, if they stop it, if they're able to control that, then maybe in theory, will that next phase be prevented? And so that's what they are working to study. And this is the name of their treatment. And they do have a disclaimer at the top. It is not approved treatment right now for MASS, but they do have this drug. And they know that if hypothetically, it could stop MASS, as we just said. So they want to see, because wouldn't that be an amazing feat if it did help with the progression? So she talked about an early study. So in the beginning, if you were on, we talked about different phases of clinical trials. And I mentioned that in the very beginning, there's only a handful, and it's even more difficult when it's a rare disease like Stills because it's harder to recruit. There's less people, but it's still equally as important. There's this early results. They had 9 patients and they had very positive, but again, you cannot really make a conclusion that is scientifically considered this will like credible. I guess that's the word I'm looking for. Scientifically credible if it's only 9 people. Because again, think back to where you're talking with people you know in different support groups or online communities. You can have 9 people and they all have completely different responses. So 9 is great that they had positive in those 9, but okay, what if 9 more people came in and didn't have the same? So they need to recruit for a bigger trial. So that's where they are right now in that. And we will, at the end here, we will provide you with more information if you want to learn more about that trial. We're going to watch yours from Ablo Therapy. Again, think about, you can think about the need for targeted treatments. What are your thoughts on needing those? I see a little sign saying my internet is a little unstable, so let's cross our fingers that I get through this last little video snip.
Initially, most patients are started with NSAIDs and steroid treatments, and there are some short-term and long-term side effects with these treatments. And then for patients that don't have any sort of improvement of their symptoms, they're called refractory patients. They are patients with a disease or condition that doesn't respond to treatment. Then you have the stronger drugs. So those disease-modifying agents like methotrexate, or IL-1, IL-1 beta, IL-6, and anti-TNF antibodies, which we've heard people talk about today. And here are some of the names of the drugs that are currently used. So, and what's very, very important, as Jeanette said, you guys set me up really well, that patients have to be carefully monitored for the development of MAS, macrophage activation syndrome. And while many patients do derive at least partial benefit from some of these treatments, some patients remain refractory, they don't respond at all, or they'll partially respond, and they're called partially refractory. So here at Avalo Therapeutics, we believe there is need for more targeted therapies. And so we're targeting IL-18. It's, as Rashmi has said, and Jeanette has led up to it, IL-18 has really shown a critical role in various anti-inflammatory diseases. So right now we are targeting Stills. And so if you take a look at this, it's a little similar to the figure that Rashmi presented. IL-18 correlates with Stills disease activity. So if you look at this, in this study, 38 patients were diagnosed with adult onset Stills disease, 20 patients with SJIA, and then they wanted to look at patients, they took 65 adults and 23 children who had fever and or arthritis, but didn't meet the diagnosis for acute onset Stills or SJIA, and they served as their comparison group. And so if you look at the comparison group versus the patients that had the disease, you can see that IL-18 is almost 1,000-fold greater of elevated IL-18 serum levels. So we believe it's a significant and important biomarker in AOSD as well as SJIA. And so if we can find a biomarker, then hopefully we can try to decrease those IL-18 levels, and the disease hopefully your symptoms will decrease. That's the theory that we're using. So you can also find IL-18 in other inflammatory diseases because IL-18 is part of the inflammatory pathway. But again, unfortunately, AOSD has the highest. So compared to lupus or systemic sclerosis or rheumatoid arthritis, or healthy patients, you can see that the IL-18 levels are markedly higher in AOSD patients. So based on that, and then also very, very similar again in systemic juvenile idiopathic arthritis, SJIA. And so here we have the diagnosis prevalence, again, diagnosis of exclusion, and IL-18 are significantly elevated. So if you look at SJIA active disease, and then patients with partial remission and patients with remission, you can see that when IL-18 goes down, so do the symptoms, and then these are our comparator groups.
So that was the last segment that we're going to play, because I'm going to just talk through the rest of it. But to point out again, it's that we're talking really more about these targeted treatments. And I think that is really important to note, because I've talked this whole time about clinical trials and the different phases, and it can take 10 to 15 years to get a drug to market. But one of the things that our organization is very invested in is precision medicine. And precision medicine is really starting to focus in more on those biomarkers, more on those different things that can be measured in your blood, or your blood pressure, or different just things that can be measured, and understanding the subgroups. And we call them the atypical typicals, because we tend to think that more people are atypical or wouldn't be able to be in normal clinical trials than typical, or that's general patient population. In saying that, we are very vested in starting to better understand who can be matched with the right treatment at the right time. So she went into this study here, and again, it was pretty scientific. So I decided instead, why don't I make it a slide and just walk you through a couple of the main points here. So essentially, they have tested this drug, this IL-18 anti, which means again blocking it, in a different disease. It wasn't adult onset. It was COPD, and you can see the kind of the takeaways were really that it was well tolerated. And it looks like there were 25 patients who took the active drug. And so so looking at the no serious side effects, mild side effects. I know side effects is a big one when we talk about treatments, and well tolerated. So that's kind of safety and efficacy. That's what these early trials are really trying to achieve. And again, they are always on a small group, because if there is anything adverse, you certainly don't want it impacting a whole lot of people. But the good news is now they've moved past, and they've shown that there's safety and efficacy, and so they're ready to move on and test it to see if it will work and they're doing adult onset only because a lot of times in clinical trials you cannot there's different legalities, there's different ethical things that come up when you do a trial on a juvenile. So that's why you tend to see this you'll see the adult onset. But I want to remind you, if you've been with us since the beginning, if Still's disease is a continuum, then if they're testing the adults, theoretically, this should then also have equal response in that same subgroup, right? So just remember that when you're like, oh, it's only adult. No, it's Still's disease. So I wanted to point that out as well. And then this was a slide that she had on the actual trial. And again, I think Katie shared that with you. And that is the last one that was there. You can learn more on the clinical trials link. And the things that I highlighted that I think are the most important that you might want to take away here is what they're trying to achieve. So in their trial, a primary endpoint is the most important thing you're going to measure. And then the key secondary or exploratory are, okay, we believe that these can also be important. So, but we don't know that they're going to make as big of an impact as the primary. So that's where they're still going to measure those though. And so I kind of highlight what those were. And I did also in the bottom here do our little definition. And I'm sure most of you have heard these terms before, but maybe didn't know what they measured. So your CRP for inflammation, and ESR is really looking at the red blood cells. And so that's kind of their endpoint. They're hoping that at the end of the trial that they'll be able to really see an improvement in the blood work and the biomarkers, a change in those IL-18 levels that we saw in those earlier slides that are really elevated in certain people living with Still's disease. So it's very positive. It's an exciting time for research. And again, if you're interested in that, then we do have the link for you. You can learn more that way. But one of the things that I ended on talking about in the presentation was about shared decision making. And if you are interested in joining a trial, you really need to talk to your doctor. It's very important, whoever is your treating doctor, but also family members. I mean, there's other people that might be involved in helping you make this decision. But really, it comes down to getting education first. Education about what trials are. We are more than happy to provide you with more information on that. You can also look up on the FDA or the EMA and their website. Just type in FDA clinical trials or EMA clinical trials. There's a lot of good information on there. But you want to know, you want to understand, and you also want to know what phase it's in, and your doctor can help you with that as well. Ask, why would you want to be in the trial? So there are always going to be pros and cons. And in our patient population, which is a little bit different than others, it's really usually down to continuity of care, which means, is what you're on now working or not? Or it's access. I can't get access to anything, but you could in a clinical trial. So there are certain reasons that you might want to be part of it, but you need to make your decision, and by including your treating physicians. And we will be providing kind of a toolkit as well for those who will come to either the full webinar or this rewatch party to help you start that conversation. Some doctors participate in trials, and so they'll talk about it, but other ones never bring it up. So if it is something that you think you might be interested in, it's not always easy to have that conversation or to start it. So we'll help you with that. Okay, so it looks like Katie has, yes, toolkits are amazing to have, Crystal. So here are the links again, but Katie has put those in there for you. And that is really all that we have today. I wanted to make sure that if you missed the original webinar and you wanted to see the highlights and maybe join in any other conversation, or I could be here to answer questions or put things in more layman terms, that's what my goal was. So I hope that this was understandable and informational. And again, you can always reach out to us and find us at AiArthritis on any of our social media channels if you need more information, or you can email us at info@aiarthritis.org. So have a fabulous Still's Disease Awareness Day. We will be posting some brand new awareness posters that are created by listening to people like you. And those are going to launch the first 3 today. And then the rest of the month, we'll be working with more people living with these diseases to design the rest. So if you haven't already signed up to do that, make sure that you sign up for the AiArthritis Voices program that we have, and we will connect you to that private online space so that you can also be part of the next 9 awareness and education posters that teach the world about Still's disease. So again, happy Still's Disease Awareness Day. Signing off. We got some work to do, but we're glad that you joined us today. Thank you so much.